Hello, welcome back. This is my kitchen in my new apartment that I've been in for the last 2 years, and it's meant to be a temporary space, and the kitchen is not really suited for like two-person cooking, let alone like one person filming with all like the stuff in here. So I'm smooshed in a corner. I hope I can demonstrate this appropriately, but what I really wanted to share with you is how I got started in baking. And a lot of people, they look at the concept of scratch baking as this unattainable task, and it's the same thing that I used to. I grew up in a house without flour. We've never had flour, and probably the closest thing that we'd ever come to having flour in the house was either pancake mix or boxed cake mix. And to me, baking a cake from like a boxed cake mix, that was scratch baking, because you're not buying it from the store, you're mixing stuff together, you're baking it at home. That to me was scratch baking, and I didn't realize that the idea of being able to bake things from ingredients and bringing it all together and following a recipe and actually making it from the ground up was humanly possible outside a bakery. And I learned how to do that by way of starting out with boxed cake mixes and like slowly DIYing. And by way of DIYing, I got a little bit more confident. And the more you DIY, the more confident you get to like move out of your comfort zone and try new things and experiment. Before you know it, you got the flour and you're following recipes. And here's the thing, if you could follow the instructions on the back of the box, you can follow a recipe. It really is easy. It's following instructions to the letter. You just make sure you follow it. And the fun thing about recipes is the more you make the same recipe over and over again and you follow that particular recipe, the more that you can kind of become confident and change it and DIY it and make it your own and know that it's not going to come out messed up. I am going to be experimenting right now with something I never have before, and that is jam, because we're going to be making kind of Halloween themed cupcakes, and obviously gluten-free, as you can see. I have an autoimmune disorder. I cannot have gluten or else bad things happen to my body. We're going to be using these cake decorations, which will be featured on the top, and I want to do sort of blood drip. And with the blood drip, I didn't want to do like any food coloring or like gel or dyes or anything like that. I wanted to try something a little bit more natural, and the idea I had in my head, I don't know if this is going to work. I have raspberry jam. I might need to run it through a sieve because it has seeds in it, but I'm thinking if I heat up the raspberry jam and like drizzle it over the top, surely that will work and look like blood and not congeal in the microwave and turn into a solid mass, right? Most of my baking videos, features like some form of experimentation, like things I've never done before, and I mess up. But it's part of the fun, right? It's part of the adventure. I'm going to show you how to DIY a box cake mix and make it taste more like it's something from the bakery. Because on the box cake mix, it tells you you want water, eggs, and oil, right? Still going to add the eggs, but instead of the oil, we're going to replace that with butter. Instead of the water, we're going to replace that with milk. So that's going to make a much creamier batter, and it's going to make it taste a lot more professional. Frosting. I never made frosting from scratch until I was like in my 20s at least, maybe even, no, 20s. I always just bought like the containers of like Duncan Hines, and that's what I thought frosting was. I didn't realize that it was so easy to make buttercream frosting at home. And this is how you do it. Butter, powdered sugar, and then add a little bit of milk as you go, just to cut in and out as you would need to. And this whole thing can be made vegan if you know. Obviously, you can use, in place of the milk, you can use plant-based milk, plant-based butter, and that's really it. Got my baking cups. I went with spider. I got my hatchets, knives, and cleavers. Obviously, we got the cake mix, and I got a measuring cup. What else do we have? I'm going to be using my stand mixer. You don't have to do that. You can either whisk it by hand or you can use one of those like hand mixer things. Either way, it's going to come out fine. So I have a camera set up here too. Hopefully this works. This is like a new setup for me, and I'm really excited to see how this works. If I can actually film two things simultaneously. Let's just try it out. Okay, so butter, for what we're working with, we want at room temperature. Through the butter. The reason we want it at room temperature is that when you're making the buttercream, it's just going to work a lot easier that way. Baking tin. And that's it. I'm going to get started. I'm going to grab the milk. So this wants us to have 1/3 of a cup of butter. So the fun thing about butter is it comes with measurements on it. What is on my hand? I didn't touch anything yet. Oh, it's begun. So as you can see here, 1 tablespoon, 2 tablespoons, 3 tablespoons. So it's going to kind of help you measure it out. So it also says 1/4 of a cup, 1/3 of a cup. So right here, this much is 1/3 of a cup. It wants 1/3 of a cup of oil. It's getting this much of butter. So it's really easy to do the variations that way. It's really good that butter does this for us because it kind of makes life a lot easier. And then for the 1 cup of water, 1 cup of milk. So let me turn this on. So I'm going to be using the stand mixer. Oh, this is exciting. Okay. So I have, oh God, I don't want to open that. I just opened my escape the room game. No! On the stand mixer, I put my whisk attachment, but you can also use the paddle. But for this, I would just rather use the regular whisk because I want it like nice and fluffy. Because when you're working with anything gluten-free, it tends to kind of fall like hockey pucks. So like the general rule when you're using anything gluten-free is that if the recipe calls for baking powder, add more baking powder. If it doesn't ask for baking powder, add baking powder. I feel like a professional. So I have a funny story about cupcakes. So when I still lived at home with my parents, and like I said, this was like back in my box cake mix days, I was with my ex, who was in a band called Matrix. And his band was opening for another band called Be Born Baton, which is they're a synth pop band. And they were playing at our local club night, and I decided, because we were going to go there early and everything, they had to do sound check. I was like, hey, I'm like 18 years old, and this is like my idea at the time. I'm like, I'm going to make cupcakes for everybody, and then everyone's going to be happy, because that's what you do, right? And I wanted to kind of make cupcakes, but using cupcake mix. So this is when I found out we're going to do 1 cup of milk. Attacked by bats and everything. And this is when I found out that my boyfriend at the time was very territorial over baked goods. You know, we'd been together for a couple of years, and he kind of said that he had like things with baked goods, like especially when it came to cupcakes. He loved cupcakes. And as we're waiting in the car, and then, mind you, these are just like your Duncan Hines cupcakes with probably the Pillsbury frosting. I literally went with whatever was on sale. I'm like on an 18-year-old's budget. It's your standard store-bought cake mix, your standard store-bought like little icing, and that was it. And it was, I did chocolate and I did vanilla, so I had a batch of 2 dozen. So we're going to put the milk in. 1 cup of milk, and then we're going to measure out 1/3 of the butter. As we're waiting in the car, we're actually waiting for the owner to get there because they had to get in. It was like 2 hours before the club opened, and we had to get there for sound check. And we're waiting in the car, and as we're waiting in the car, I'd never seen anything like this. I kind of thought it was a little bit like, I thought it was comical because I watched him reach over, rip the tinfoil off the top like a lunatic, and like started double fisting cupcakes in his mouth. He ate like 6 or 8 in the car. I'd never seen anything like that. It was kind of as if he didn't want anybody else to have the cupcakes like they were his cupcakes. And it was then that I was like, okay, maybe he is telling the truth about having like an issue with cupcakes and being territorial with baked goods. So I go in, and suddenly his stomach starts to bother him, and I don't want to turn this into like one of those gross videos, but let's just say that he paid dearly for his actions and did something in a club that no one ever wants to have to do in a club. But that is my my weird cupcake story. Starts to kind of work its way up the sides. You're going to want to shove it down with the rubber spatula. It smells good. It smells like Funfetti. I've never used this before. So I think what you'll probably find is when you use butter instead of oil in a recipe, that it tends to be a bit thicker than the batter would have been otherwise. But it still works just fine. So a lot of people are concerned about like licking the spoon when it comes to the batter, and they think it's because of the eggs, but it's actually not because of the egg. So people think you can get salmonella from the egg. It's not the egg. It actually comes from the flour. Flour poses a much higher risk for foodborne illness than raw egg does. So that's why they tell you don't eat the raw batter. That's interesting. You can tell immediately that it's gluten-free, because gluten-free, like gluten-free batters and everything, they tend to have more of, it's less smooth than it would be with regular flour, and there's almost like a powdery consistency to it, but it's not at all unpleasant. It doesn't taste bad. It tastes really good, but it's just the consistency when you're used to like things that have gluten in it. You're used to like glutenized stuff. This is like the texture is just going to throw you a little bit. Other than that, I'm surprised. This is not overly sweet. I was expecting it to like blow my face off with sweet, but no, it's not that bad. Okay. So now we start. That's about, I would say, enough. You want it to go about halfway up. Probably like reassess as I go and see where it falls, because eventually it's just gonna settle. But my oven's been preheating, so these can go straight in. And I want to check the recipe, because it's one thing I didn't look at. I wanted to look at bake time, because that's another thing I noticed after I started baking things that are gluten-free. The bake time is a lot higher than it would be if it were just, you know, regular straight up gluten variety stuff. This made a lot of batter. I did not realize that hope my neighbor likes murder cupcakes, because we're gonna have to share. This is gonna be too much. Yeah. Every jar that I get, it's free Tupperware. So if you get jars, like glass jars for anything, you're getting free Tupperware. Don't throw them out. You can use them to store anything. Look, hazelnuts in a sauerkraut jar. This is another sauerkraut jar, and this is pumpkin seeds. This was a jam jar, and they're now chia seeds. Take advantage of free receptacles. So I'm actually going to use this to store my leftover batter. That made a sound that was very funny. Now we're going to do the buttercream frosting. And usually you put vanilla in it if it's going to be a vanilla one, but I don't want to complicate things, so we're just going to leave the vanilla out of it. And we're just going to do regular powdered sugar. I use a lot of it, as you can see, so I have like a big thing of it. Powdered sugar, butter, and we're just going to add like tablespoons of milk as we go. And you want a pinch of salt. Always unsalted butter, by the way. The reason you want unsalted is because you want to be able to control the amount of salt in it. So you just add like little tiny bits at a time, so you can kind of like adjust it to taste. And with these, you never know how much salt is going to be in it. Some salted butter is like super salty, some is more subtle. So you never know what you're going to get. So always go unsalted, better safe than sorry. So we want 3 cups of powdered sugar, 1/3 of a cup of the butter. And you kind of want to go by eye and see. I think I just put butter in my hair. Yeah, just a little bit of butter. Hopefully it's good for me. So that's about there. So since I've already cut out a bit of the butter from this one, I don't want to use another 1/3 of a cup there. So we're just going to do this. This is softened, and the reason that it's softened is because we really want it to cream up really fast. So I'm going to throw that in there. And then this. And then this. Looking at this, I might want to add a bit more butter as we go. It's going to seem like a lot of powdered sugar. And that's because it is a lot of powdered sugar to make buttercream. All right, so we want 3 cups of this. This is about to get messy. I know I'm going to throw this everywhere. Fingers are butter fingers, literally. Okay. All right, so we want 3 cups of the powdered sugar. Yep, there we go. Want a paddle attachment for this because you don't want to whisk it. You don't want too much air getting in there. You want to do it kind of like gradually. And also, doing 2 cups of powdered sugar first. And that is because I want to do it gradually because this is going to like shoot up in my face. Consistency I want, but there's not nearly enough of it, so I want to double this batch here. So it's actually calling for more powdered sugar because I only put 2 in there. So I'm going to put I'm going to double this up. I'm going to add the remainder of the powdered sugar that needs to go in, the 1. But then I'm going to start adding more butter, and I'm going to double this batch. There we go. Another 2. And the thing about the milk is you want to keep adding in small increments as you go because the amount of milk really does vary, and it's all about getting the texture and the consistency that you want. Always add less than you want, and then you can always increase because if you add too much, you're just going to like turn it into a sugar soup. You don't want that. So I'm trying to keep this as simple as possible, and once you kind of get more and more into baking and more into the whole process of it, there's probably a few tips that if you're a baker, you noticed that I completely missed. And if you're panicking over it, don't worry. The reason that I'm doing it is because I don't want to overwhelm people who are starting just from scratch. So one of the things that I would have done differently if I wasn't trying to keep things as simple as possible is I would have run this through a mesh sieve, which is one of the, you're basically sifting it. And the reason that you're sifting it is because you want to work through all of the lumps. You want to get those lumps out, and you want this to be as fine as possible. Otherwise, you end up with like little lumps. And if you plan on piping this, it can get stuck inside the tip. But if you're using like a big tip on the end of the piping thing, it should be fine. You end up with a much smoother buttercream if you sieve it. Also, let's see, I'm gonna add like, oh, that is way too much salt. The reason that we also add salt is you want that balance. You don't want things to be too sweet because if you notice, this is predominantly sugar here. This is a lot of sugar right here. So you want to kind of balance that out a bit. And I'm going to be adding more powdered sugar now. Want to scrape because I see chunks of butter here, and you can add more butter or more powdered sugar as you see fit, because if you're piping this, like I said, if you're going to be like piping it onto something, you want your buttercream to be a little bit thicker so it stays stiff. But if you're going for more of just like a regular topping, this is actually kind of the perfect consistency. There's like hecka buttery. It was really buttery. I think I want to add some vanilla to this because I want to add a little bit more depth to it, because right now it's just buttery sugar, which does not taste bad by any stretch, but vanilla is going to even that out a bit more. I had to just stop myself because I have pumpkin spice essence. That would not be good. Sometimes the temptation is real. Next, transfer your buttercream into a Ziploc bag and then store it in the refrigerator until you're ready to use it. Once we're ready to use it, we're going to use the Ziploc bag to pipe the buttercream onto the cupcakes. Smooth it out in the bag and work out any bubbles, but just keep it from going into the corners. We're going to snip off the end of one of those corners to pipe, and if there's any frosting that's too close to the corner, it's going to get really messy when we cut it off. This is nicely chilled, and I want to try to keep it away from the corners because I want to cut a little bit here, and then you want to be able to kind of squeeze it and pipe it that way. I will say, as far as gluten-free is concerned, this, you hear that? It's a bit firmer, like a bit breadier, I want to say. Like, smells good though. I just get concerned that I'm going to cut off too much. It's a bit firm at the moment because it's been in the fridge. So I'm going to break it up a little bit. So since the tip is quite small, I could probably be able to cut a little bit more off and get away with it. Delicious mistake. Boop. As it softens, it gets a lot easier. I probably could have done well to keep this at room temp. Oh. I love that one. I'm not a cake decorator. When it comes to baking and things, I'm more about flavor than I am about presentation. So I tend to keep things very basic, but I've always been very interested in the aesthetic side to it. I've just not been great at it. That was the bag, not me. You'll find that there's some air bubbles in here, so you gotta try to work those out, because if you're going for perfection and you find an air bubble, it's gonna create an icky result. Literally could not tell you what that noise was. Wow. Look, we're like pretty much at the end, and we did all the cupcakes. So doubling the amount that I needed for the buttercream was perfect for a dozen. If you're going for this amount of buttercream, some people don't like this much buttercream, but for this particular one, more is more. It's satisfying to see it come out so smoothly and go around like that. Ugh, gives you like chills. Mountain of butter. Buttercream, anyone? So, this next part is where the experimentation comes in. I don't know how this is going to turn out. I've never heated up jam before, but I want to kind of heat it up and then drizzle it as if it were blood. Gonna give it a try. So I did the jam onto the cupcakes. However, I wasn't recording on this camera. I was recording on that camera, luckily, but I wasn't recording on this camera. I just got my jam out of the microwave, and it's kind of bubbling a little bit, but I want to run this through a sieve because it has bits in it, since it's a raspberry jam. You obviously don't have to do this, and if you want to kind of not have to do this, just get seedless jam. I just kind of went with what I had on hand. It's a good consistency. Maybe if I just more drizzle it. Okay. I think I know how I'm going to play this. Ta-da. And for this one, we're going to do a cleaver. I'm going to do it. Stick it kind of like that. There you go. This is very therapeutic. Just trying to figure out how to get it in. Delicious raspberry murder. I'm not great with the decorating. However, I like the fact that it looks a little bit more realistic with the drips, and the fact that I use jam instead of like a gel. It's obviously it's raspberry jam, so it's going to give a more like natural flavor, which I prefer. But when it's hot, it's going to drip easier. But once it cools, it's going to congeal. So I'm happy with the way these came out. What do you think? If you try out any part of this, if you try out the gluten-free baking mix, or if you try the DIY where you use the butter in place of the oil and the milk in place of the water, let me know. Or if you just try this entire thing out. I want to know. Tag me. Let me know in the comments. And until next time. Bye.